Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Just this last weekend, I went to a really special tournament called Clash for the Cash over in New Jersey. And it was special because I got to fight probably the highest rated longsword fencer in America twice. I got to fight him twice because it was a double elimination bracket tournament, and it was the only two losses that I had that day, so it was a pretty good day. So we're going to review that fight, but before I do that, I want to give people a little bit of a warning. I recorded all the footage for this with a high-speed camera, and as many of you probably know, fluorescent lights and high-speed footage don't mix well. The result is that when I sped the footage back up to a normal speed, there's a whole lot of flashing lights still and aliasing, like a big red bar that climbs up and down the footage over and over again. Hopefully it's not too distracting, but I think it was worth it because the slow-mo footage that I got is actually very illuminating. So with that, let's watch the fight. So to get started, I am going to be on the right in all of these exchanges in black. Steven is going to be on the left in white. And we start off this first exchange with both of us sort of sitting on the outside of each other's range, trying to use footwork to get the other person to commit to something they don't want to commit to. In this particular case, I catch Steven in a little bit of a stutter step where he moves forward, perhaps where he intended to move backward, and I take that opportunity to try to thrust his face. Now, the judges call this a clean stab for me, but actually, if you watch the footage again in slow-mo, what you see is that I just barely miss. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, judging in HEMA is not perfect, and you can't ever expect people to see the kinds of things that slow-mo footage can show you. But I think it's still very important to watch this again in slow-mo because it tells you a lot about, in this particular fight, how tight the defenses of both of us were. We weren't really letting things get through, even though it looked like they got very, very close. And being able to fence to a degree where you are dodging something by mere inches is, in a lot of ways, the best way to defend yourself from pretty much any attack. What you're going to see now in the second exchange is going to be a pattern that will continue throughout the fight. Both myself and my opponent are going to sit on the edge of each other's distance and look for opportunities not only to throw attacks that are feinted, but most importantly to parry any amount of overcommitment from the other person. The reason this can work, and the reason why you will see exchanges where we both will throw repeated attacks at one another, is that distance plays the ultimate role in defense. Now, in this particular exchange, I throw a little bit of a feinted attack, my opponent parries, and throws a counterattack that just barely misses my head. And the reason it does is because we were fencing at that edge of distance where just a couple inches of leaning back can get you completely out of the area. This is important for how this fight is going to go because every single time one of us gets a very clean hit, it will be because the other person overextended in their initial attack. For the next exchange, you see me trying to implement the fencing system that I've made a couple videos about now, where I try to predict what my opponent is going to do based on what they've done previously. And so far, my opponent has done a very good job of being aggressive towards me, but then, defending himself as he exits the action. So my thinking was that my opponent was going to try to switch to being defensive, so I decided to turn up the aggression. You see me use some very offensive footwork, coming forward, threatening, trying to set up some kind of feint, and then just defaulting to throwing a Hail Mary thrust directly at my opponent. Now, on top of that, my opponent will sometimes jump up in the air as a method of trying to basically trigger some sort of response from me. And in this particular case, he gets exactly what he wanted because he jumps up in the air, and I think that this is my opportunity to throw something hard and deep so that I can maybe hit him while he's in the air. Unfortunately, I don't exactly time it right, or at the end of the day, it was a bait, and my opponent very easily parries my shot off to the side and throws a repost to my unprotected hands. Now, to his credit, the hand shot that he throws was probably in one of the only spaces and angles that you could probably hit my arm, given that the thrust that I throw is with my crossguard parallel to the floor, meaning that descending cuts on top of that angle and towards the arms have a tendency to get tangled up in that crossguard. So it wasn't exactly a bad, undefended attack from me, but it was an extremely skilled and extremely precise attack and counterattack from my opponent. Now, this next exchange is one of my favorites in the fight, specifically because of what the slow-mo can tell you that your eyes might have told you differently. My opponent comes forward with a thrust, I parry it off to one side, and I throw two Zverkows, one to either side. Now, looking at it, and based on what the judges said, I miss on my first left Zverkow, and I land on my second right Zverkow. But if you watch the footage very carefully, what you see is that I throw my second Zverkow pretty flat, but the area I hit is actually pretty unusual. If you watch it again very slowly, what you see is that in a way, my opponent does put up a very credible defense, and it's only the floppiness of the sword that allows it to kind of wrap around and sort of slap my opponent in the shoulder/neck area. A very interesting exchange, because what it tells you is that fetters, as being just a little bit floppier than real historic swords, need to be thrown edge on in order to do damage. But sometimes the speed at which this is happening means that even though you're not really throwing the most obvious flat strike of all time, your sword is still going to warp a bit in the air, even in dimensions that you don't think it really should, resulting in my second Zverkow, despite the fact that my crossguard indicating that it really wasn't the flattest thing of all time, comes out almost completely flat once it actually makes contact with my opponent's sword. This is why edge alignment can be so important, and why it can be so important to train edge alignment in something other than sparring. In this next exchange, we see a perfect example of why Stephen Chaney wins so many HEMA tournaments, and that is his single time, what he calls, or at least what other people call, a ballistic cut. Now, as you can probably tell from watching some of the other exchanges, my opponent fences with his right leg back, whereas I fence with my right leg forward. And the reason my opponent fences with his right leg back is because he uses it to power this cut, the cut that you see in this exchange. He makes it come out very, very quick, and because he pairs it with a passing step, it can actually reach very, very long distances, longer even than my ability to lunge and thrust. So in this particular exchange, I'm trying to go for the same kind of aggressive, threatening stab posture that I had in one of the first exchanges, but my opponent has adapted to me, and he's essentially waiting for me to try to provoke by extending my hands, and he's going to use that as an opportunity to whack me right in the head and then wind his blade after it lands towards my sword. And this works out perfectly for him. Despite the fact that I was simply coming forward with a lunging stab, my opponent's ballistic cut is so fast that it reaches my head and closes the gap before I can get my tip online, despite the fact that it started off more or less in line. I make the critical mistake of trying to threaten on the onside and then duck underneath and go to the offside, and as a result, I waste just a crucial couple of milliseconds. That is, of course, all it takes for me to get hit directly in the head and lose the exchange. This is also another one where the slow-mo footage is very illuminating. It might look like we both hit each other very quickly and very hard, but if you watch carefully, what you notice is that my Dirtwechsel, my feint from one side to the other with my point, actually loses me the exchange and completely ruins my thrust. This is something that you see a lot of people do, where they use feints as a method of lowering their opponent's defense. But if there's no defense to lower, a feint can very easily ruin your action and make it so it doesn't land at all. For the next exchange, we see a repeat of earlier, where I commit a little bit too much to an attack on my opponent. My opponent parries it and then responds with a riposte to my right hand. This time, I put a little bit more effort into trying to parry it with my crossguard, but as you can see, once again, the angle that my opponent takes in attacking that hand is so steep and so unusual that it actually is extremely difficult to guard, even if you're pointing the crossguard in the right direction. This is what we call an expert level of precision. It's not necessarily that there's anything about this technique that's special. Cutting to the left side and attacking your opponent's right hand is a classic defensive move, but in this particular case, the mastery comes from the ability to put the sword exactly where you want it to go, regardless of where you had parried previously. As you can see, my opponent parries on his right side and then comes around and throws that left cut directly where it needs to be to get around the parry that he knows I'm inevitably going to throw. For this next exchange, you'll probably recognize it already as being the YouTube short that I put out yesterday, so I won't go too deep into it. But basically, this is a perfect example of why judging in HEMA can be so very, very difficult. My opponent lunges in deep and fast with a thrust that, as far as anyone can tell, just barely misses my chest. Afterwards, I attempt to throw a couple of counterattacks, but the problem is that the halt had already been called, which means that I'm not really putting a whole lot on these after blows. And the reason why this can be very good to watch, especially in slow motion, is it tells you exactly what the blades are doing during high velocity motions like these. The blades that we use are only a little bit more flexible than historic models, but the reality is that even when going through the air, a piece of steel will deform and bend in so many unusual ways that it almost looks like we're fighting with pool noodles. The reality is, though, of course, that they are still steel bars, and they don't actually feel like pool noodles when you get hit by them. This next exchange is one of our longest, and it is one of our longest because both myself and my opponent were being very defensively minded the entire exchange. It's also, I think, part of the reason why I was able to successfully get off a clean hand hit, and that is because my opponent seemed like he was hesitant to use his favorite move, the ballistic cut towards my head, as a counteraction to the kind of setup that I was going for in the second or third exchange. The idea here is that I was going to use my point forward stance and my aggressive stutter stepping footwork to keep my opponent guessing as to when I was going to attack, leading to him constantly moving backwards and fishing for parries so that he could throw good counterattacks. Eventually, I managed to get close enough with my footwork and to get him to bite on an attack that was not there, leading to him parrying onto his left side and opening up his right arm for a cut, which I deliver. And due to the fact that my opponent was already stepping backwards when this happened, he wasn't really able to respond with an afterblow given that he was at a distance. This is something that he has done to me several times already in the fight, but it was good to have pulled it off on him in the other direction, not just because it's a nice point, but also because it shows just how much adaptation matters in bouts like this. It matters that my opponent had switched his style from being aggressive to being defensive, and that I was able to capitalize on that by being aggressive, because it shows that the defensive mindset that my opponent had used to beat me previously might not continue to work. Coming up with this exchange, we see one of the messier exchanges that we had during this fight. Now, the setup for this is something that we've talked about already. I go for a thrust, my opponent parries me offline, but due to the distance that we were at when both came forward, we are in such a distance that both of us could pretty much hit each other clean whenever we felt like. The problem is that my initial Zwerkow, after being pushed offline, goes clean over the top of my opponent's head, which is quite an accomplishment considering that we're both pretty tall and he's even taller than I am. At which point, realizing that I've completely whiffed my right Zwerkow, I throw a rather crappy short edge back cut that I use basically just to try to ensure that I get some kind of points in the exchange. But in my mind, it was not a particularly good cut and something I just did out of desperation. Meanwhile, while I was throwing this very bad Zwerkow over the head of my opponent, he delivers a cut to my head, upper shoulder area, and in my opinion, gets a clean exchange. However, of course, this is something that you can only really see in the slow-mo, where it's obvious where the intents lie in each person's cuts. I don't envy anybody who has to judge an exchange like this because, as you can see when you watch it at full speed, it's so fast that it's almost impossible to keep track of what both people are intending to do when both people are intending to do something at the same time, and one of them, namely me, happens to just mess it up. What you're going to see in this next exchange is probably the only time where I capitalize on an overextension from my opponent. But the reason my opponent overextends is not because he made some sort of misjudgment, but because there's an inherent amount of overextension that is required to throw a big thrust. Think about it this way. In order to thrust an opponent effectively, you have to deliver your point at least 1 to 2 to maybe even 4 inches past your target to get that good bend. If you're extending your arms and trying to thrust someone who's moving backwards, that means you have to thrust 4 to 5 inches past where they're actually currently standing. meaning that in order to thrust someone who's going backwards with proper bend, suddenly you're having to thrust upwards of a foot further away from where you think the person currently is. This leads to situations like you see in this, where my opponent is trying to chase me down with a thrust, and after I parry it off to the side, he has committed so much forward momentum that he can't get his feet under him fast enough so that he can parry the follow-up cuts that I have. Almost as if I can hear myself giving bad advice, I immediately tried to do the exact same thing that Steven had tried to do to me in the previous exchange. I commit fully to a very deep, very long lunge, which my opponent is very easily able to parry off to the side and hit me in the hands. The key, of course, being that my overextension means that I'm unable to get my feet underneath of me after my thrust misses, and I'm unable to defend myself probably from 2 to 3 more cuts before I'm actually able to recover. For the penultimate exchange that we have, it is, of course, another messy one. Now, the reason it's messy is because it's very fast and there's not a lot of time to really register what people are doing, but this is again where the slow-mo can be very informative. As you can see from the footage, both myself and my opponent come forward with a hard attack that ends up in a high bind. Specifically, the kind where both of our forward momentum meets together at the crossguard and both of our hands inevitably get pushed up. However, my opponent does something very smart. Out of this situation, he does what I think I would call a kind of Kronhau, where he essentially winds his blade up, twists his wrists, and then throws his short edge down on top of my head. Now, unfortunately, as you can see in the slow-mo footage, the sword just can't take that kind of speed, and it warps in the air to such a degree that it almost appears to land flat on my head, despite the fact, again, that my opponent's crossguard was pointing in the perfectly correct position. I believe that if this was a stiffer, more realistic blade, this would have easily scalped my head quite cleanly. However, you have to go off of what you see, and it was such a fast movement that the judges didn't actually see it happening. At which point, I shove this attack off to my side, and I throw a quick right Zverkow underneath of my opponent's blade to hit him in the shoulder. I then keep my blade in that position to try to parry a follow-up, which it looks like I kind of failed to do. Meaning that we both hit each other pretty much 2 to 3 times each within the span of 2 seconds. Meaning, again, that this is something that is almost impossible to judge, but under slow-mo conditions, you can see what may have happened if we were using actual swords. For the last exchange, a rather disappointing one on my part, my opponent simply throws a probing hand cut on the outside line, and I basically just throw my hands right into it. But it's worth pointing out this exchange because this is something I see a lot of people do as a bad habit that I've, again, talked about in another video, where when you're trying to cron parry an attack that you think is coming in, I throw my left hand further forward than my right hand, which makes my crossguard point straight up and down, it's true. However, it completely exposes both of my hands to an attack, and as I'm shifting my stance from left to right in order to try to parry what is essentially a shot on my right side, I basically end up just throwing my hands directly into it. It's something that everyone can do and adjust in their own fencing and learn from so that you don't end up looking dumb like me. And with that, that is the entire fight. As I said earlier, I lost this fight and another fight to Stephen Chaney earlier. I reviewed this one in particular, which was the second fight, because I thought it was a little bit more interesting with some more adaptations and because I did a little bit better. But if you'd like to see a review of the first fight, feel free to say so down in the comments. Or if you just want to see other fights reviewed like this one, just like and subscribe, and I'll be sure to be making more. Thanks, and have a good one.